Well, Jason, welcome to the podcast. This is episode 15, I believe, and we this is the journey, and on the journey, it is just a story of individual stories of ordinary people and their stories as they go through transformation throughout their lives. If they've had setbacks, if they've had struggles at different times, and how they work through those. What did they learn from that end of it, of going through those struggles, and then what have they, most important, what have they learned from it, and how are they doing life now as a result of that? So, Jason Gautier, we've known each other for quite a few years.
Yep.
Yeah.
Probably 10.
Yeah, I was going to say at least 10 years. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, well, before we get into too much of your story and that aspect of it, why don't you tell us a little bit about what do you do for fun? What do you do to relax? What do you do if you have some downtime when you're not working and being with family?
I have 4 kids, so I don't have much downtime. Yeah. A lot of my downtime I spend on bicycles. I have been collecting projects over the last couple of years.
Okay.
Trying to get into those. My job is essentially a hobby for most people, so I do a lot of side work and just to relax. Carpentry.
Sure.
Yep.
So I remember when we, after we first met, I remember you telling me stories about biking, and so when you say bicycle, that's probably not the full story of what you do as far as when you're biking.
At this point, it sort of is. I've kind of stepped back a little bit.
Oh, have you? Okay.
Well, just because of my kids. I want to put the time into them. They're 9, 11, 13, and 15. So they're all involved in baseball and softball, football, and basketball. So I put a lot of time into them, and honestly, take a lot of enjoyment from supporting them in all their sports. And
gotcha. And so as the kids 9 to 15 and boys and girls, kind of give us the breakdown.
2 boys, Zion and Zeb, and then Ophelia and Oliver. So
and Oliver's the youngest.
No, Oliver's the oldest. Yep. So it's Zeb is the youngest. Zion is 11, Ophelia's 13, and Oliver's 15.
Gotcha. All right. Yeah, that's a pretty wide range there.
It is.
Yeah. And so then your oldest is a sophomore in high school?
He is a sophomore.
Okay. Yep. And what schools do they go to?
They go to Byron High School, or Byron schools,
Byron schools. Okay. Yeah. Well, good. So then you are also work as a carpenter, and so tell us a little bit about.
I've worked as a carpenter for the last 18 years. I've stepped out of that role into more of a sales, management, estimating, bidding type role. Essentially hung up my tool bags and moved into the office.
And how was that? How was that transition as you went?
It's been good. There are days that I'd rather be out swinging a hammer. But there are days that I wake up in the morning and my body says, you don't need to be going back to doing that.
That's after too many days of swinging a hammer.
It is, yes.
Sure. Yeah, I can relate to that on a certain level. We're doing a remodeling project at our lake home up in Wisconsin, and we volunteered to do all the demoing of that and try to save some cost. And that was definitely an interesting experience. But,
it's not like television.
No, not at all. My dad had a handyman business when I was growing up, and so I had an opportunity to help out with him and learn some things at that time. And then there was a pretty big gap where I didn't do much because of sports and bodybuilding and school and college and things like that. But yeah, it's been fun getting back involved with it. But I don't remember being this sore back then.
Well, we're all a little older.
Exactly. So So I know that you've had a pretty interesting of your own story, not only from the aspect of what you have now worked your way from in carpentry and all the different things you've done with that, but then also your own personal story. And I just want to invite you in because you're doing some pretty interesting projects now of helping other individuals out and trying to raise some awareness. But why don't you tell us a little bit about how that, a little bit about your background and a little bit about your backstory.
Okay. When I was 2, my dad died of lymphoma.
Okay.
So raised by a single mom, primarily with her family as her support.
And you were the only child?
At that point, I was.
Okay.
Yep,
Okay.
At that point, I was. And then, only child, kind of had the world.
Sure.
My mom got involved with an individual around my age of 8, 9, 10 years old.
Okay.
He was put in prison for child sexual abuse.
Okay.
We moved closer to where he was going to be. And again, not really had much care about anything. From the outside, from what I knew, we did well. My mom was still there, had a lot of friends. And then all of a sudden, I was put in foster care. My aunt came to visit us. She became aware of maybe something happening to me at some point when he got out of prison. Tried to put me with my dad's parents, but because I grew up with my mom's family, they really felt like I should be with them. So we kind of went back and forth with that struggle.
So your maternal grandparents were advocating for you to be with them?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, gotcha.
I think, and obviously I don't know because I was pretty young at the time.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that because it was my mom, and it was her family that was fighting for that, fighting for essentially my safety.
Sure.
But from her perspective, I was being taken away from her. So she wanted me to go with my dad's family. Neither one of them, they didn't really get along through that period of time.
Okay.
So the state decided that they would put me in foster care.
So because they couldn't figure it out, so to speak.
Yes.
And then the state intervened and said, okay, he's going to go into foster care.
Right, correct.
And so just to make sure the timeline-wise, so you were 2 years old when your biological father died.
Yes, yep.
And then your mom met another gentleman, another guy. How old were you when, was it 8 years old when mom had met him, or?
He was actually a pastor at the local church.
He was pastor at the local church.
So I had known him for a while.
Okay, so you guys had known him for a while.
Yep.
And then, so when you said, and I think I lost this part of it, when you said you were 8 or 9, was that when you moved closer?
That was when we moved closer.
Yes. To where he was being.
Yes.
He was in prison at that time.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And to a closer proximity to that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And when I guess your aunt came in and had observed something. Was he still in prison at that time?
He was.
He still was. Okay.
Yep. Soon to be getting out.
Okay.
Between the time she found the evidence and him getting out is when I was put in foster care.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And was that in the same community that your mom was living in, or was it a different community, or?
It was the same community.
Same community.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And you were 8 or 9, maybe 10 years old at that time.
Yep.
And now you're in foster care. And so what was that experience like?
My foster care experience, fortunately, was was good.
Okay.
I was in 4 different foster homes over a 2-year period, I think.
Okay.
And none of the moves were because of bad situations, bad homes. It was life, really. The first family that I lived with, she had just finished her degree and was going back to school. The second family that I was with, I think they had just had enough. It had been a while, and their kids were getting older themselves.
Okay.
The third family I was with, I still keep in touch with.
Okay.
Their son is the same age as I am.
Okay.
And they again had a string of a few rough kids, and were pretty much kind of just done at that point.
Yeah.
I moved in with another family, and then my grandparents got custody of me.
After that fourth?
After the fourth, yes. So I moved in with them the second half of my 6th grade year.
With your grandparents?
With my grandparents, yes.
Now, and this was your mom's parents?
Yes.
You're okay.
Yep.
So the ones who originally you wanted to go with, and originally, or your aunt
I was going to say, I don't know that I ever had a choice. Necessarily. Yeah.
Or your aunt thought you should go with, type of thing.
Yep.
And it's an interesting. It's interesting. A lot of the stuff that you're talking about, you didn't have choice in. It was all other people making choices for you based upon a need for safety, a perceived need for safety. But it was a lot of adults in your life making choices for you.
Right. Correct.
And so when you think back to that time period for you, what were you thinking? How was that? What was going through your mind as all this was happening? I mean, you probably didn't physically remember your dad.
Nope.
But you remember seeing pictures and things, and the stories that people told you because of how old you were.
Right.
And then at one point you said, well, you were an only child, you were with your mom, so you had the world at your hands, and then things started changing.
Yeah.
And so what was that experience like from what you can remember?
Well, like I said, it was a lot of adults making choices for me. Mm-hmm. Of course, as an 8 to 12-year-old, that feels right because that's what they're supposed to do.
Right.
They're supposed to protect you and guide you and do all that stuff for you. So I don't know that I felt externally like anything was wrong. I mean, obviously it was. I was being moved around and there were things happening, but I never felt like it was not the right thing to be happening. I didn't feel unprotected, really, through that.
In those 2 years of the 4 foster families that you lived with, and then eventually your grandparents, were you changing schools that often too, or were you?
We moved to Marion, Illinois. I moved to another small town for 1 foster home, and then was in the same school for the next 3.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So at least you, for the most part, had the same friends, or could at least had the opportunity to have the same friends, the same school environment. So it wasn't like you were bouncing around all that much.
Right.
My background is a school social worker, and there's sometimes when I've heard these stories, similar types of stories, for individuals that have been involved with foster care and have had, maybe for different reasons, but similar types of transient, moving around and stuff, that they were angry, and they were angry of not only why they were in foster care, they were away from their parents or away from who they wanted to be with necessarily, but then they were angry because of the constant feeling like they were visiting and never really feeling grounded. But that doesn't sound like that was necessarily what you remember of it.
No, it's not what I remember of it. I do remember, though, times of displacement. There were times I definitely acted out. threatened to run away. I got into fights that I wouldn't typically get into. I was a good student, so I kept that up. It actually wasn't until I moved in with my grandparents that part of it changed. But I think that was what I had to hold on to.
Was academic performance?
Yeah, academic.
Okay. Yeah. All right. And did you play sports, or were you involved with activities, or was it mostly just focused on doing good in school and then whatever was going on at the households that you were staying at?
Yeah, I was involved in sports. I played a little bit of soccer.
Okay.
I played some basketball. Obviously, some of the stuff that I didn't feel like I was, out of sorts, displaced necessarily. There were things that happened to me physically that looking back were definitely signs of, like, I went from being this rail physically, size-wise, to a heavy-set kid. So playing sports and being self-conscious of myself just didn't happen at that point.
Okay. So there was some body image.
Yeah.
There was a weight gain.
Yeah.
And how old do you think, or grade were you in when the weight gain began?
4th, 5th.
Oh, okay.
Grade.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this was before the weight gain happened, prior to the first foster care.
Right around that.
Time.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Kind of the transition.
From
the hometown I grew up in to Southern Illinois, and then moving into foster care. Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
And then, and so then you moved into with your grandparents, and so tell us a little bit about what that was like. And if I remember correctly, your grandmother, they lived on a farm.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And because I remember you telling me multiple stories about the farm.
Yeah.
And so what was it like being there? I mean, obviously this was a familiar place.
It was a familiar place. Moving in with my grandparents, they really were my grandparents and continued to spoil me, kind of let me get away with whatever I wanted to. Thankfully, I didn't get into too much trouble. It was, from my perspective, just normal adolescent trouble. I did let my grades suffer. I would stay home from school because I was sick, and I didn't want to go. I was picked on, made fun of. I was the new kid, but I wasn't the new kid. I had gone to the same school, 1st and 2nd grade. Moved away, came back in 6th. So I knew a lot of the kids, but I missed 4 years with them. So
it's a pretty big difference.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Do you think maybe thinking back on it, because it sounds like a lot of times when young kids are not wanting to be moved or displaced, or so they will do things to, how can I get approval, how can I please? Other times we might respond because we don't think we can please. We might respond with anger. Do you think maybe that might have been part of what was happening with the grades? That you didn't want, you wanted the foster parents not to have to worry about that or be upset about your grades, so you did well in school because you could, and it was also maybe an easy way to get validation and affirmation, and so to secure some level of stability, you could have some part in that by your performance in school, where when you started living with your grandparents, maybe you knew you were set, and maybe and there was a little bit less structure from that, or internally you knew you didn't have to work as hard because they weren't going to, you weren't going to get moved again.
Correct. Yeah, I think there's some validation.
Sure.
Ability to do that.
And I can see that even with my own experience of I want to see what kind of control that I can have.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things that you could was the academic piece.
Yeah.
So you go through high school. And do you have much contact with your mom, or?
When I moved in with my grandparents, the role that they had and the role that my mom had kind of flipped. My mom was who I visited on holidays and occasionally throughout the school year in the summer. Much in the same way you would your grandparents.
Sure.
My grandparents became, my home.
Essentially your parents.
Yeah.
Though they still treated you like their grandson.
Yes.
And not necessarily disciplining you or guiding you the same way as their own son.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Correct.
Okay. And then you graduated from school, right? And,
I did.
And what high school did you graduate from?
Macon High School.
Okay. And then what did you do after high school?
Then I went to college. Okay. I started my college career in information systems. I decided that after a semester, a desk job sitting behind a computer was not where I wanted to be at that point. So then I ended up going down to Southern Illinois. Okay. And got a degree in agriculture.
Oh, okay. All right. Mm-hmm. And did you end up doing anything with the agriculture degree?
Nope, not at all. Not at all.
Okay.
Nope. And SIU is in Carbondale, which is where my mom lived. Okay. So she kind of became a parent again. I would do my laundry there. She would, have meals for me occasionally if I ever needed to get out of the dorm. Okay. That's where I went. Okay. And at that point, I had a sister, half sister, who's 11 years younger than I am. Okay.
Yep. And was she at that time, or I guess is she now, still with the same?
She was at that time. He has since passed away. Okay. I think Oliver, my 15-year-old, was 2 when he died. Okay. So yeah. Okay. Yep. So she was with him then at that point, and so she was living with him in Carbondale when you would go and do your laundry there or whatever it may have been. Okay. Yeah. Did you have much interaction with him or no? Some, at a distance. Yeah. I didn't want to rock the boat too much. Mm-hmm. That's never really been my ideal, so I didn't. Yeah.
And clearly, Mom had a strong loyalty to him.
Yes.
And so that was very apparent based upon even from an early experience in your life. That, even though you may not have known what was really going on, but clearly there was a loyalty on her part to him, and or their relationship, or however she would define that. But that was a pretty clear message.
It was. It was even to the point where when I was in foster care, I had visitation with my mom, and she would take me to their house and drop me off with him. So at that point, the fear that my aunt had of me being abused when he got out of prison came to fruition. Okay. So under the care of the state of Illinois and the foster care system.
So you're in foster care because Mom is with someone who has been arrested and now imprisoned for being a sex offender. I'm assuming to minors, right?
Yes. Yep.
And she is having a relationship with him. She didn't have a relationship with him before he got in prison, did she?
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
Assuming now, yes.
Okay.
But yeah.
But she then moved to closer proximity of him. Yeah. And at this point, nothing has happened to you. No. But there was concern based upon how Mom was with him that if and when he becomes released,
he'll be living with her.
Yes.
So that was the grounds in which you were removed from the home.
Correct.
Okay. And then when Mom would have visitation, or when you would go and visit Mom, she would leave you unattended, or she wasn't there.
Yeah.
With, for all sakes and purpose, your stepfather.
Yeah. Yep.
And then he did abuse you then.
Yes.
At some time during that time period.
Yeah.
And so that would have been, well, somewhere between
10 and 12.
10 and 12. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Yeah. So your aunt's fear then did come, so to speak, true.
Yeah.
Of what could happen. But this was all under the time period when you're supposed to be protected by DCFS and the foster care system.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So clearly somebody dropped the ball.
Right, yes.
Yeah, with that. I mean, and obviously we could start, unfortunately with your mom, we could start there. Mm-hmm. But even with that, what we call now is supervised visits. It would have been a supervised visitation situation, right. And that wasn't what was happening, obviously.
Right, and there were times, it was gradual. I had supervised visits with her during the week. Evenings, mm-hmm. a couple times a week, supervised visits, I think every other Saturday.
Okay.
For a time period in the morning, and then it shifted to, then unsupervised visits, like on Saturdays or whatever.
Okay. And so sometimes during that unsupervised visits is when the abuse happened.
Yep.
So, and did you tell anybody? No. And what was the concern, or thinking back about? I mean, you were young, so I mean,
right.
What do you think was one of the multitude of factors why you may not have shared anything with anybody at that time?
I don't know, honestly. I don't know why I didn't, because that was kind of around the same time that the whole movement to, telling people, and if anybody touches you inappropriately, that's kind of around that time that all that kind of started. Yeah. I don't know why I didn't tell anybody. Okay. Obviously, I didn't have a dad. Mm-hmm. Passed away when I was 2. Yeah. He was the closest thing I had, mm-hmm. Essentially. Looking back, I mean, there was my grandpa, but he was not in the picture at that
point. You're still in the foster care.
We're still in foster care. And I'm sure is the norm with that type of predator. Mm-hmm. I love you, mm-hmm. you're, and all that garbage.
Well, and there is, and I'm glad you bring that up, because there almost always is. I was doing some of my talks for the SOS, the Shed Our Silence, and one of the portions I talk about is sexual assault, and the research shows that 1 out of 6 boys are going to be sexually assaulted before their age of 18. And 1 out of 4 girls before 18. But 80% of the time, it's by someone that the family knows, or that the victim knows.
Right.
And so it's a family member, it's a friend of the family members in some capacity. And I think then with that, then also comes a different element of grooming that happens by the perpetrator, and so it does become subtler and in a much more unfolding way, where it isn't like what you see in the movies, where it's that other 20% that's the stranger, and it's more of a one-time act, and it's aggressive, and and where it's much more subtler, which then can be much more confusing,
right.
and play all these other divisive games in the young person's
thinking.
Right.
It's like that's very much was part of it, because I'm guessing he definitely had the ability to be charming when he wanted to be charming, and so I imagine it was a pretty confusing time period, let alone risky, because you already been being bounced around at different foster cares, and what else could happen, right? So there's all these different elements that could play a part into it. So then you, at what point did that all come out, that you had been sexually abused?
It came out, and not really came out. I got to the point where I felt comfortable talking about it. So I was in college in Carbondale. I met my first wife in Carbondale. We had a strong relationship. I do remember telling her at some point that I had been abused, just because I thought that's something that, a spouse should know. But that was kind of as far as it went. It was never addressed further. And from my perspective, and I'm not putting her at fault, but from my perspective, that's all that needed to happen. I needed to tell her, and that was it. And so it was out at that point.
But she was young too,
right? Exactly.
And so, so she, probably didn't even know what to do with that information. And it was a long time ago. So
right.
You shared a secret, right? And so okay. So then, how old were you when you guys got married?
22.
So you guys
22.
were young when you started a family. You got married and started a family soon after that. Okay. And I know a little bit. How long were you guys? I mean, obviously you had 4 kids, but how long were you married?
We were married for 10 years. 10 years. And we have 4 kids. We had 5. We had Zeke, who was born a year before Oliver, and only lived a week. Sorry. Lived a week.
I'm sorry to hear that. That's a tough go as well. How when you think back about that was 10 years, and that time period, and raising kids, and going through the loss of a child, but yourself only being 22.
Right.
What do you now? You'll look back on that time period. What would, if you knew now what you know now, but didn't know then? Right. What would you tell that Jason back then?
I would tell him to take a step back and recognize and understand the different events that have happened in his life. Because if you don't, they just pile up on top of one another.
And that's what you would tell a 24-year-old Jason or a 26-year-old Jason. And when you think back, what was Jason of 24, 26, 28? What was he doing? He wasn't stepping back and looking.
No, he was just moving forward.
And just trying to make things happen.
And I was under the impression, that's just how it worked. You just kind of push through and make it happen, and that's the way the world works.
And so you get divorced. You're 32, 33 years old. And then that's a whole nother series of losses, a series of things that you go through with that. And then if we fast forward a little bit to where you've been at in the last because you're how old right now?
42.
Okay, so you've had 10 years since the separation and divorce. And so where would you say for you, as things started, maybe you did learn how to just step back, and it was, as you mentioned, it was was more than just revealing a secret,
Right.
But it was more than that. So maybe tell me a little bit more about what was happening then.
So after I got divorced, I was working for myself. Had a lot of free time. That was when I was doing a lot of writing.
Okay.
I kind of felt like at that point, that was my out. I was working out, exercising, spending time with friends. Went through a couple different rough relationships. Not rough in that they were tough, but they were struggles for me internally because I couldn't settle. No matter how good the relationship looked like on the outside, my heart, my mind, whatever, just couldn't settle. I thought I got out of that, and then, was in a really good relationship for a while, and even that went south. There was always this need to have an out, to have a backup.
So not 100% committing.
Right, correct.
So
in my head, committing, yes, but just something inside me wouldn't commit.
Okay.
And I didn't have necessarily physical relationships outside of the one that everybody saw, but had online stuff going on and just nothing healthy, aside from what was on the outside, what people could see.
So, okay, just to paraphrase what I think I just heard you say, so you'd be in a relationship with someone, and everything on the outside may appear to be looking fine, but and looking like you were all in, but then there would be some other situation, either someone online or someone that you were connecting with, you're communicating with, and it might be what they would consider like an emotional affair on that relationship, and even if it never manifested into being sexual or physical, but there was this distraction of that was one way of preventing being 100% committed into that relationship, and then 100% vulnerable in that relationship. And so I imagine, just knowing you and how you internalize things, I imagine that when those relationships would fail inevitably, because the women would feel like they weren't ever getting enough, and something would happen, right? And then you'd be sad, go through the whole process of that. When do you think it started shifting? You started taking a turn and looking at doing some things different?
Because I was in that essentially good relationship, really good relationship. I had everything going for me. Didn't really have to do much as far as providing and kids. It was just kind of all there. All the ducks were in a row. And then even that that relationship went south. At that point, I just kind of hit rock bottom. I moved out. Stopped eating, worked a ton in that transition period, threatened because I didn't know where all of it was coming from, and didn't really feel like there was any kind of end to it, because I had tried for years to talk about it, talk to different people, seek counsel, and still, even with the counseling, had this external part of me that wouldn't let anybody in, wouldn't let people wouldn't let myself tear it apart.
Okay.
And get to the bottom of it.
Okay.
So I've spent the last 2 years, of the last 2 years, the first 6 months to a year, just digging into everything that has gone on.
Okay.
And it's never been to the point where I was on the streets. I never got into drugs. So my whole life has been this blue collar / white collar life. So I think I've kind of hidden behind that, internalized everything behind that, and never felt like I had to dig in and tear it all down.
And so in the process of doing that inner work and knowing, because of now, not only what happened growing up, right, but then a marriage that ended in divorce, and then losing a child in that marriage, and going through a series of different relationships, even to that very last one when everything was supposed to be right, and still you weren't right within the relationship.
Right.
That ends up being your bottom. It thrusts you into a whole other place that I must be the common denominator here. Because now there's no longer an excuse that it's somebody else. It's something I must be doing or not doing.
Right.
And then with that, what was then for you? What did you start discovering about yourself? What are you doing differently now? What would you? What are you doing? What's different now? As you're, or are you able to find some level of peace and being able to practice that vulnerability? Practice being able to be 100% in.
Yeah. I don't know. I wish I could explain it. I wish I could wrap it up into a formula or a package and put it on the shelf.
Sure.
Because I mean, it has been life-changing. I essentially just started praying. And I know praying means something different to everybody. I'm a Christian. I believe in God. I don't know. I'm still not exactly sure what that looks like or means. I have my idea of it. I feel like I do have a relationship with God that probably doesn't look like a relationship to God or with God to a lot of people. But I just started this series of prayer and exploration and giving everything up to whatever. And I've done that in the past, to the point where, I'm like, okay, God, I can't do this anymore. It's up to you. And just kind of let it go with that. I've realized that it takes that, but it also takes work on my part. So I started putting some work in. I started seeking different counseling. I went to a psychologist for a while, and then I got hooked up with the Rockford area sexual assault council. Got in with them and started figuring out how talking about things isn't necessarily enough for me. I learned about trauma and how that affected me. I think I was afraid to be a victim at some point, and have realized that being a victim is okay. It can be taken to an extreme. But for me, I've strung everything together. I've put a timeline together and realized that even though on the outside my life has looked decent, normal, a lot of stuff has happened that affects the psychology of a person.
Sure.
And so I've It's almost as if there was a switch flipped on, and I've kind of not looked back since that happened.
Well, as we talk a lot of times here on the journey, we talk about Joseph Campbell's work in the hero's journey and using that template. And many times we may have the opportunity to do life different. And Campbell refers to that as being in the first phase of separation. But whatever that normal is for us, there's a tendency for us to resist that and go and pursue that. And usually it's based upon some kind of fear. If that is the fear of pursuing our adventure or pursuing our bliss, or if it's the fear of doing something different and being hurt again. And it sounds like there had been opportunity either in relationships or with people you met or previous counsel or whatever it may be, that there was an offering and an opportunity, but you were not at a place of readiness for a variety of different reasons. And then when that comes is when you've said hitting a bottom, and they'll talk about in addiction work is very much that same way, is that we hit this bottom, or we can't do this anymore, or it's the beginning. It's the acknowledgement of death to ourself. In the Christian spirituality journey, it's a similar type of thing, is to die of oneself, to then go through the initiation phase, which is the second phase of being born again. I think sometimes in the Christian church it ends up being a matter of minutes where they, from the moment of recognizing your sin to the minute from that to walking down the altar and saying the prayer, and then you walk back and everything's different. And for some, maybe it is that way. And for others, like yourself or like me, that initiation phase is a much longer phase of being the awakening that comes is a process. And so we meet people who can mentor us through that. We learn to do some things different. We learn, we have helpers, we have dragons that we have to face, obstacles that we have to overcome. And that's all in that initiation phase. And it sounds like, to me, there's a lot of reasons why it makes sense to me. The abuse piece of it didn't happen until you were a little bit older, but the loss of your father from cancer, and not having a male role model, and not being fathered, and mom being distracted, not only maybe with her own grief, but then with this other relationship, you were making up stuff as you went along. And survival, by being good, survival by being compliant, leads well to building a false self. And they're much harder to find those wounds when something didn't happen versus when something did happen. And we can talk about it. Oh yeah, I didn't have a father. But now understanding, as you become educated on trauma, by not having that father, it's one of the things I think predators look for, especially with abusing boys, that they look for that absent, either physically absent or emotionally absent of having a father, because then they can come in and fulfilling that grooming role, and it's easier. That wasn't your fault. You had nothing to do with that element of your father, your biological father, not being there. But it very much was a wound, very much was part of your story that you had to then later readdress when you're 40, 39, 40, to start looking at and moving through that. One of the other things that we talk about as we discover that, and it's not just an event, right? It's a process of continuing to learn, and then we learn a little bit more about what happens in that initiation phase. But then there's an element where what we've benefited by being in that initiation phase, being in that dark night of the soul, we bring back to others, bring back that gold. And I know that you're working on a project in which you're trying to bring some of your awareness and some of your experience. And so tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, there's a little bit of backstory. When I moved out and, started moving through this process, things have just, like I said, started happening. A couple years ago, I decided that I was missed somehow. Kids like me were missed in the whole process of foster care and maybe the transition to a permanent home, because I wasn't acting out. Essentially, I was not skipping school. I wasn't on the street corners. Something was missed. So I had this idea that you and I have talked about a few times, and kind of creating some sort of program that grandparents, parents, permanent families can learn maybe how to address these issues that these kids that now, because they're safe, that's all they need. But there's more than likely something that's going to come out down the road,
right,
and they're going to have to figure out how to deal with that on their own. So that idea has been there. That's been part of my learning about myself, and how that can be addressed. That kind of, it didn't go away, but I tabled it for a while and just kept moving forward. I bought a house. My kids are comfortable with where I'm at. I have a job that I like, that I appreciate. I've just kind of let things happen, created goals that I'd never had before. And then about a year ago, I came up with an idea called the Johnny Jar. And with that, have kind of realized that what I can do with that and how that can support my previous idea.
Okay.
And I've kind of, I guess, because of where I'm at now and where I was in the past, I feel like I have a lot more ability to let things happen, not be afraid of where they may stop. So I've kind of just pushed forward, and the process, and every day I'm in awe of the process, because it just keeps moving without essentially me having to do anything. I think it's a belief in they can happen.
Yeah. So instead of you constantly pushing or pulling at it,
right,
to make it happen on a certain timeline or schedule, it's you're allowing it to unfold as it needs to unfold.
Right. So essentially, now, this past April was the 12th time that I've brought my grandpa home from Florida. Okay. So for the past 6 years, I've driven him down and flown home in the fall.
Okay.
Flown down and driven him back in the spring. So I've done that since he was 90. Right after his 90th birthday was the first time I did it.
Okay.
He just turned 95 in December.
Okay.
So last spring, we got in the car. He put our coffee in mason jars and then put a lid on the top of it. It's hot. I couldn't drink it. Our 20-hour ride home, I came up with this idea for a coffee cup style lid that would screw on a mason jar with a handle. Again, one of those ideas that you think, is anybody going to go for it? Mm-hmm. So when I got back, I approached a couple people, and essentially it just kept moving forward. And I've told a lot of people I didn't get laughed at, so I just kept moving.
Sure.
And it's to the point now where it is a viable product. Originally, it was just going to be the lid with the handle. Now we have glass jars with my grandfather's name on them.
Okay.
And with that, and how I've realized that because I've thought about the first project that I started, mm-hmm. And how I've kind of tabled it.
Mm-hmm.
If you sit back and are patient, you begin to see how everything comes back together.
Sure.
I think the Johnny Jar can and will be something, but because it has a story behind it.
Right.
It has my grandpa's name on it. It's essentially his legacy.
Mm-hmm.
That will be carried forward,
mm-hmm.
And a legacy that brings a family along with it that has been through essentially everything that you can go through.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, alcohol abuse, body image, eating disorders, depression, divorce, death. It's all there.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, in a family that grew up in a small town in central Illinois,
mm-hmm.
and we've survived it all.
Mm-hmm.
And we're, I would say at this point in our lives, on the upswing, and where 2 years ago, I could not have been a part of bringing that family forward.
Mm-hmm.
Through my self-awareness and my struggle,
mm-hmm.
The fight that I've fought the last couple years, I can,
mm-hmm.
And I will,
mm-hmm.
essentially, I think, do achieve what I want to, and bring a lot of things to light.
Mm-hmm.
My grandpa has a pond that has a cabin on it.
Okay.
And sorry, Grandpa, for saying this, but the cabin is not inhabitable by anybody.
Sure.
I want to not only be able to support things like SOS,
mm-hmm.
But I want to create at the pond that has been called Johnny's Party Cabin. I want that to become someplace where people can go and celebrate whatever it is that they've come through.
Okay.
Whatever struggle they faced, if they want to do it by themselves,
mm-hmm.
they want to do it with a group. That is a big part of where this whole thing has gone, sure. And coming. I want it to be a destination.
For like a retreat celebration.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. Somebody can stay,
mm-hmm.
Or if it's just a day thing, just
okay.
So that's kind of the latest and greatest of it all.
Okay.
And again, don't really know how it all works. Don't know how it's going to happen. How the ideas have even come to.
Yeah.
But just the faith that they are there and they keep they keep happening.
Well, I think very much as I'm listening to you, I think it's very much of, in addiction work, they talk about trusting the process.
Right.
In the hero's journey, it is what happens with all of us as we continue to walk the journey and be aware of where we're at on that cycle. In the Christian spiritual journey, it's about continually being in relationship and walking with.
Right.
But I think as I'm listening to you tell the story today, specific, in relation to you, it is for that group of individuals who, on the outside, all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted and the boxes are checked. Yeah. But inside, there's an emptiness. When we're constantly trying to please others and still getting our needs met, we may never find our authentic self. We may never allow ourselves to. And that idea of being broken and then having to do more than just talk about the wounds, but then find out how were you impacted by those wounds and what did happen and then what didn't happen as a result of those wounds and what that was like and how to then be vulnerable and open yourself up to being hurt.
Right.
And so all those things I think is part of what I'm hearing you say, and now wanting to educate other individuals, have your story out there, like you did today, but then sometime in the future, whenever that'll be, maybe as a result of the Johnny Jars, then even going to that next level of having a celebratory center or a retreat center for another part of your grandfather's legacy.
Yeah.
It is interesting. We talk about this all the time, how things will come that full circle. And so, Jason, as we wrap up for today, if there was anything that you would want to share with anyone listening, and many times we have people that will listen to the podcast and are looking for hope or strength, or how could they necessarily, if Jason was able to do this, maybe it'll help me. But if there was anything that you wanted to share with anyone listening?
First of all, everything is really good right now. The journey has been great. It's not like that every day. It's not all unicorns and rainbows. But I would say to just keep moving. Try to understand where it all comes from. Try to understand that there's a purpose for it all. Not necessarily that things happen for a reason, but there is a purpose.
A purpose that can be found in.
That can be found. That we all as individuals have a purpose. And understand that purpose may not be realized today, might not have been realized a week ago, but that it will be. There are a lot of things that I can do today that without all of the work that I've done, I could not have done 2 or 3 years ago.
Sure.
And 2 or 3 years ago, I didn't have any desire to do any of that.
Yeah.
I was just where I was, status quo, and assumed that I had to just push through it. And that's the way my life was going to look moving forward. But it's...
it's interesting is I having known you, like you said, for 10 years, and this is probably, maybe that's what the biking used to do for you. It was, instead of just getting by or just getting through or just existing, now it sounds like life is a little bit more adventurous. And it's adventurous because you're maybe more fully present now than you have been at other times.
Yep.
So, Jason, I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you sharing your story. I look forward to seeing how how it continues to unfold, and then just listening to you as you learn more stuff about yourself and how you fit into the fabric of other people's lives as well. So
thank you.
So Jason, thank you again. Yeah, and we'll have to have you on in a time period in the future when all this stuff is the Johnny Jar's out for public, and see how the rest of your adventure is going. So
sounds good.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
So thank you very much for being here with this episode. We will have another episode next week, and look forward to being with you then. Thank you.